It seems as many have forgotten that the winners in history write the history. And so the histories that we have available are written by the winners. In other words, written by the conquerors. And part of conquering is identity theft. Part of conquering is rewriting reality. And that needs to be kept in mind when thinking about all of these ancestral narratives and all of these conquest histories in the Americas. And so you had these contact dynamics with different groups of people, but we really don't know the truth about the contacts. What we know is that the Romans made their way over into the Americas. And the Romans, going by a variety of names, the Romans took over the Americas, the various parts of the Americas. This includes the mainland and this includes the islands. And part of the identity theft dynamic is superimposing the identity of the conqueror onto the conquered, or simply removing the conquered from the face of the earth. And so that's a part of the dynamic that we have going on with a number of these purported American Indian tribes, a number of these civilized entities. We have a number of Romans, whether we are talking about Rome in Rome or whether we are talking about the Holy Roman Empire. We have a number of Romans who have superimposed their identities onto entities in the Americas, or they have simply wiped out those people and replaced them, and their names are their names. We're going to look at one particular group, which is the Seneca. And for most of the narratives, we have these papal bulls coming out in the 1400s. And so we know that there were contacts, as far as we have it based upon this history, in the 1400s. Now, what's interesting about these contacts is when the people are being described. What it looks like in some instances is that they were describing themselves and telling people that they discovered some people that looked like themselves. And so, therefore, the identities were conflated. And so in the 1400s, we know that the Romans, according to their own narratives, arrived here in the Americas and that there were conquering dynamics that took place. Some people believe you can put on an outfit, a costume, and then that makes you whatever it is you are purporting to be. And that's what you have in a number of instances with these purported American Indian tribes. And so if someone is coming to take something and they want to claim it as their own originally, then they would, for all intents and purposes, create an entire narrative that would go along with that. And that's what it looks like occurred in this particular situation. Now, you had the Moriscos and the Moranos doing most of this. And so this was some very slick stuff that was going on with these identity dynamics. And that's part of the reason why you keep finding these manifestations of the Romans in the Americas. The Romans conquered the Americas. And so don't forget that. And so when you see the manifestations, whether we are talking about the phenotype, whether we are talking about cultural dynamics, you should expect to see these dynamics going on. The people were conquered, and we really don't know how many of the people continue to remain past this conquest. And part of the conquerors, they were different phenotypes. And so some of them were presenting as what we would consider traditionally African, and then some of them were presenting with a traditional European phenotype. But those entities were working together. They were one and the same. They were the Romans. Before examining this Seneca construct and this purported indigenous group known as the Seneca, we are just going to make a couple of observations related to some of the identity dynamics. And so, one thing that the Seneca were purportedly known for was being the keepers of the Western door. This is another group of people related to the Longhouse dynamic. And so, what's interesting about this is that the Seneca were not located in the western portion of the United States or the Americas. They were located in the eastern portion. But there are a number of narratives with these collectives of people related to people being identified as Western, Westerner, Eastern, Easterner. And with respect to this Western identity, what comes along with this is that Iber or that Eber. That's what goes along with this narrative. It's important to keep in mind that the conquerors were the Eber. Let's be very clear for those of you who are identifying as Moor, those of you who are identifying as Hebrew Israelite, those who are identifying as Jewish, those who are identifying as Muslim. Those are the entities, according to the identities that arrived. Those were the conquerors. Those were the colonizers. Those were the ones who brought these new cultures over. Those were the ones who took their identities and superimposed them. And that's why you see so many of these cultural artifacts. Whether we are talking about cultural artifacts related to religion, whether we are talking about cultural artifacts related to mythology, whether we are talking about cultural artifacts related to customs and mores, all of that is a part of the colonization dynamic. Whether we are talking about the genetic superimposition, because when you look at certain clusters of entities in the Americas, you see that genetically they are now not only the indigenous people of the Americas, they are also part European, they are also part African, they are also part Asian. And part of this is a new dynamic with respect to the coming over. And there are all sorts of interesting narratives about how these various Indian names are translations of Indian words that are then anglicized. That would be completely unnecessary because all they would need to do is call the individuals by whatever the indigenous name happened to be. But this is a part of the game playing that is going on. And so we have Seneca, who was a Roman statesman. And so now the Seneca tribe is, for all intents and purposes, the children of Seneca. So they are the children of Rome. They are the children of this particular entity who was born in Spain, according to the narrative. And so there is a Moorish narrative that goes along with Seneca. And of course, that's consistent with the Moorish identity being superimposed onto those in the Americas. Now, a number of people are reiterating these narratives that they are getting from individuals who are identifying themselves as Moor, identifying themselves as Moorish, but you have no reason to believe them any more than you believe any other conquest narrative. And so here we have what is purported to be a bust of this individual known as Seneca. And when you see here, even though the name Seneca has Roman roots, you also see that the way that it is spelled, the way that we understand it, the tribe that is named Seneca, this is an English word. And so we have this Roman root, but ultimately this English word. But what's also noteworthy and ties this to the Moorish, Iberian, Morisco, Marrano identity is that in terms of transliteration, this is transliterating out of the Arabic. But of course, here you see this translation, and the indication in terms of the definition is that the Seneca represent a member of an Iroquoian people originally inhabiting upstate New York. And so this collective of people coming out of New York, coming out of that Delaware area, coming out of that northeastern area, they are considered a part of the 5 nations that comprise this Iroquois Confederacy. And so there is that whole idea of confederacy yet again. When you hear confederacy, when you see confederacy, the first thing you should think of is Morisco and Marrano. That's their thing coming out of the East, coming out of that area that many people consider the Middle East now. But that's where a lot of this is coming from. This is coming from Western Asia with all of these confederacies. And you'll even notice when you look at flags, you look at some of these color combinations, you can start to see these various connections. And here you see one of the renditions of the Spanish flag with the red and the yellow coloring. What you're also going to see when you look more closely at the entities that are identifying as the Iroquois, that are identifying as Seneca, you are going to start to see some of those Roman phenotypes. Now, with respect to these Roman phenotypes, you see quite a bit of miscegenation. And so the phenotypes will look very familiar if you look at them closely, and you will note that even though they are presented as American Indian phenotypes, they fit these phenotypes that you would find in Western Asia. They fit the phenotypes that you would find in the various Roman provinces. And here is one example of this. And so this individual is identified as a Seneca woman whose name in English is Pretty Flower, and this is from 1908. If you look at some of the migration information about that name Seneca, you can see how early the Seneca people actually arrived on that East Coast into the Americas. And here you see another presentation of entities that are supposed to be the Seneca people. And you can see there's quite a bit of diversity in terms of phenotype. And so you don't see just one phenotype, but you definitely see a strong, traditionally Roman phenotype when looking at the individuals that are depicted here. Now, of course, because of miscegenation, you're going to see quite a bit of variety in terms of phenotype. So there's no one single phenotype that is the phenotype for the indigenous people of the Americas. But what is important to keep in mind is that this phenotype is consistent with the phenotype of conquest. And so this name Seneca goes way back. And it's indicated here that Seneca was born in Cordoba in the 4th year BC and then went to Rome to complete his studies. And here, when doing a name analysis, you can see very clearly that this name Seneca has Roman roots yet again. And so it indicates here that the French family name Seneca dates back to the Middle Ages. It was a Norman name given to a steward of the house of a sovereign or great noble. And so here we go again with this whole great noble dynamic. And so again, this is a Roman rooted name related to nobility. And here you can see some very interesting transliterations. This is when it gets very interesting. I want to call your attention to another Moorish dynamic, another Morisco and Marrano dynamic, because it indicates here that the Seneca also have another name, a very interesting name. You've got Senecat over there on the right-hand side, but what you also have is Senegal. Yes, Senegal. The G and the C, that K sound, as you know, those sounds are interchangeable. And here you have this spelling variation. And so perhaps it might be interesting to see what happens when those European phenotypes are mixed with the Senegalese phenotypes. And finally, we see showing up in that northeastern area these early settlers in the United States coming in the 1600s. And here you see the translation of that motto, which is a mark without flaw. And of course, we've seen this motto before. And so this is all a part of this Seneca identity. And if you look at individuals who are identifying as Seneca now, they still fit this phenotype that you see that is a very Roman phenotype. And it's very prevalent, of course, in the Americas. It's prevalent more so traditionally in southern parts, however. But you do see this phenotype very often. And again, it is one of the Roman phenotypes. And so when you think about the Roman languages, the Romance languages, that's what we are talking about when we are talking about the Romans. Now, it's also important to keep in mind that Irish Scots identity and the tie between them and Spain. So hopefully you remember that, and hopefully you also remember the connection between the Jacobites and France. And consistent with earlier thoughts related to the Iroquois, we see here that Seneca, the transliteration for Seneca, is coming straight out of the Arabic language. And here you can see some of the passenger immigration border crossing information. And you can see this Seneca name coming from a variety of places. And so first, of course, you see coming from Italy, 1902. Then you see Indonesia in terms of the birthplace. And here you see some additional information and additional arrival information. So you have a number of people that are landing in Hawaii and then also coming from Italy into Pennsylvania, again, into that eastern corridor. As with many other people, if people are told a lie about their identity for a long enough period of time, they will start to believe it and defend that lie, even when there might be evidence or suggestion to the contrary. And of course, if a person is coming from a conquest ancestry, they may just inherently feel that conquering privilege. They may just inherently believe that whatever was conquered by their ancestors belongs to them, even if it is the identity of an entire collective of people. And so again, we don't really know the real histories. And so even when we are presenting things here, we are discussing these things, we only have the facts that we have at the moment. And when those facts change, we look at the new facts that change, or we look at the new facts that have been found. But it's important to keep an open mind because, again, this information, all of it, is coming from the history of conquest. And now with so much artificial intelligence, we don't know where some of these histories are coming from. It has been noted that some of the artwork that has been presented as ancient artwork looks very recent. And we are talking about artwork that we've seen over the last 5, 10 years. It looks like very recent artwork. It looks very modern. It doesn't look like you would really find it over in Europe from ancient times. And again, I will reiterate that being in Europe, I never encountered any of these paintings, these renderings that we've been presented with here in the Americas, and particularly some of the paintings and renderings that would suggest another paradigm with respect to the phenotype of a variety of people. That doesn't mean that they weren't there, it just simply means that they were not readily on display. And so here you see yet another individual with this Seneca surname from the U.S. naturalization records. And a final observation related to some of the migration that's going on all around the world. Some of the migration that's going on in terms of the Americas right now and in terms of the mainland North America, some of that migration appears to be a continuation of the original migration. So, a continuation of that Roman movement into mainland America. Some of that Roman conquest of mainland America. And so nothing has changed. It's just picking up again. It's just the appearance of what some might believe is their unfinished business. And so Rome may have what Rome believes is unfinished business. Western Asia may feel that it has unfinished business in terms of laying claim to the land that is the land of the indigenous people of the Americas.